Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Central Asia-Caucasus Institute forum, e-forum, I should say, on the issue of religion and the secular state in Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan. I hope the screen is working and that everybody can see me. Yes, I would like to first mention that we don't have any Central Asia-Caucasus Institute forum planned in the next several days. However, we should next week have had the yearly CAMCA forum that we organize in partnership with the Rumsfeld Foundation. This year, obviously, it is not taking place in person, but it is taking place throughout the week in an interactive format. You can find a full list of events that are happening this week at camcaforum.org. That's camcaforum.org. The first event will be tomorrow, and there will be events about the impact of the pandemic on the region and its economic situation throughout the week. Now, for today's event, you are welcome to ask questions or make comments at the chat feature, as well as to send questions or comments by email to askcaci@afpc.org. Again, that's askcaci@afpc.org. Perhaps Stephanie can put that out on the screen when we get closer to the Q&A session. In introducing today's event, I'd like to start by mentioning that the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute in our work has long been paying attention to the secular nature of the states of Central Asia and Azerbaijan. Few people might know that these 6 states actually constitute approximately half of the Muslim majority states that have a fully secular form of government. This is often ignored. For example, the Freedom Support Act of the United States Congress paid no attention to this issue in terms of the programs it was instituting to develop market economy and political institutions in this region. It is either ignored or taken for granted, I should say. It is also often subjected to criticism by NGOs as well as the US government, who take issue with the restrictions on religious freedom that are demonstrably taking place in this region. Because of this, you can find many reports online and elsewhere about the flaws of the approaches to religion and religious freedom that the countries of Central Asia and Azerbaijan have. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom, most prominent among them. But there is very little on what these countries are actually doing and why they are doing it. In other words, you can find a lot of information criticizing these countries, but if you want a perspective of why they're doing what they're doing, what is the purpose of the way they have organized their relationship with religion, that is a harder nut to crack. That is the reason why the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute launched an initiative on this issue about, I would say 5 years ago. And since then, we have published reports, country studies on Azerbaijan, on Kazakhstan, and on Uzbekistan. And I'm very happy to present 2 speakers today who will lead this series almost to completion. This is Johan Engvall and his study of Kyrgyzstan, and Victoria Clement and her study on Turkmenistan. These countries, of course, are, as we should see, as we will hear, interesting cases that can help us to determine whether there is indeed a Central Asian model of state-religion interaction. Next year, probably, the Institute will also be launching a more comparative study on this very topic. Now, we will now pass the word to our speakers, and I would like to ask Victoria Clement to speak first. She is one of the few people I know that have a large extent of both personal networks, experience, sources, and knowledge about what is going on in Turkmenistan. This is, for reasons that many of you know, a country that is very often bypassed, that is not involved in many of the institutions of regional cooperation. It tries to maintain what it calls permanent neutrality, and that leads a lot of people to ignore Turkmenistan or to shun the country. I think Victoria has done exactly the opposite and focused her interest on this country, and we're very happy that Victoria agreed to contribute her study to the Institute. So Victoria, the floor is yours. Please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Svante. I should start by thanking everyone who made this possible. Thank you for organizing today's event. And I also want to thank the American Embassy in Ashgabat, which helped me to obtain certain pieces of information. The Ambassador Klimov there was quite helpful. Okay, Turkmenistan. Well, Turkmenistan is a very closed society. And there, the authority lies with the state, and the country's two presidents have really micromanaged the day-to-day activities. And this hinders research on that country. So for example, Turkmenistan's Mufti, the head of the Muslim faith in that country, does not have the freedom to speak or publish at will. So while in Kazakhstan, the Muftiate maintains a website, and in Kyrgyzstan, the Mufti has aided in developing a definition of what Sufism means to the people in Kyrgyzstan. In Turkmenistan, the Muftiate has published all of 2 books in the past 3 years. And these have been very basic books on how to pray and how to fast. So in order to study Turkmenistan, researchers have to rely on personal experiences, interviews, and very limited scholarship. So I say that at the outset to give you some idea of how I undertook this study. Getting to the points that Svante mentioned, we were taking the question of what is the role of religion in these countries, but we were specifically looking at the fact that they proclaim a secular status. So, for example, in Turkmenistan, the constitution in the preamble states that this is a secular state, and the first article reiterates that, and then there are places throughout the constitution that repeat. So, for example, it is stated very clearly that the education system is a secular one, separate from religion. So the state professes to be secular. Despite that, religion is very important in the country, and Turkmenistan has undertaken a very active state and national identity building project, which has made Islam a part of that new state-sponsored Turkmen identity. So the state is steering the country. There's no question about that. The leadership is steering the direction. There is no civil society, there's no free press, and there's no free education in the country. Yet this there is a more complicated situation here than the documents like the Constitution would initially imply. So it's more complex than just saying there's a separation between church, mosque, and state. The secularism that is proclaimed is more complex. So, for example, the leadership has promoted a national Islam, and they refer to it as traditional Islam or Turkmen Islam. And that really reflects a complex syncretism that blends animism, shamanism, Zoroastrianism, Sunni Islam, Sufism, and local traditions, all in a way that the state leadership finds benign or really even conducive to its rule. And anything outside of those parameters is considered a threat to the state. So it is a complex situation that we can talk about the details of. So I'll give you some examples. For example, the Turkish Gulen movement, or excessive mosque attendance, or men under 40 wearing beards are not allowed. None of those are allowed. Those are beyond the limits of what the state will tolerate. And yet, at the same time, the country's 2 presidents have written that Islam is foundational to Turkmen culture. So I'll stop there, just put that out there as a preamble, and then see where we go with our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we pass the floor, so to speak, to Johan Engvall. who has a long history of work on Kyrgyzstan, and who also spent a serious amount of time, I think, this summer in the country, which helped him do part of the research, field research for the purposes of this paper. Johan, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I can say that, you know, when it comes to Kyrgyzstan, this was a new topic for me, looking at the religious aspect, and that was really interesting to have the opportunity to do this. We can say that since independence, Islam has become ever more important, especially as an identity marker in Kyrgyzstan. So it has an increased practical relevance really in the everyday life of many citizens. And of course, this revival, religious revival, of course, poses many challenges also for a state that is still secular. And especially since the situation in Kyrgyzstan is so dynamic and it's constantly changing, you can say. There are many divisions inside the country regarding how the Islam should be interpreted and practiced, but there are also geographical divisions. Some parts of the country are more religious than others. And then also a younger generation that is more prone to religious influence than the older generation. So you can really say that there's no consensus on the matter, which can be seen from both a few surveys, but also anthropological studies. But I think still overall you can say that Islam in Kyrgyzstan is predominantly seen as a way of life rather than a very strict or dogmatic religious system. So you can also see that the traditional coexistence between Islam and certain pre-Islamic beliefs, such as worship of nature and deceased ancestors and things like that, they still remain widespread in Kyrgyzstan. But you can say that in the early years of independence, the authorities, led then by First President Akayev, took a rather liberal approach to religion. And you could quickly see that the number of mosques and religious schools expanded really quickly, often with the help of foreign funding, and there were foreign influences here. But you could see already by the mid-1990s, the number of mosques had grown to more than 1,000, and this expansion has continued since then. And today it's often mentioned that the number of mosques have outgrown the number of secondary schools in the country. If I may mention a few aspects I mentioned about these external influences, the main foreign Islamic influences in the beginning, but also afterwards, have come from Turkey, the Arab world, and also the Indian subcontinent. Turkey was particularly active in religious training and construction of schools and mosques, and that was both through the official state, but also through other religious movements, such as the Gülen movement, and which opened several schools in the country and also a university. But Turkey has been particularly active in the educational sphere, you can say. And then when it comes to Salafi movements, primarily from the Gulf and the Middle East, they have also been an influence in the country, especially in southern Kyrgyzstan. But today, maybe the most prominent influence is from the Indian subcontinent, you can say. Tablighi Jamaat, which is a globally active Islamic movement with its base in the Indian subcontinent, and in Kyrgyzstan it has a bit of a special role. It's neither officially registered, but it's not banned either. And you can say that Kyrgyzstan has become a center for Tablighi Jamaat with a membership that is growing every year. And today it's probably the most active mass Muslim movement in the country, and it has a particularly strong appeal among the younger generation. One thing is that, of course, in the other countries in the region, but also Russia and China, they have banned this movement, and there are also sometimes some Kyrgyz politicians raised the issue of banning the movement also in Kyrgyzstan, but the authorities overall has concluded that the movement's apolitical nature allows it to continue its activities. And also the Mufti since 2014 in the country, Dr. Mushev, he is also well known for his close association with Tablighi Jamaat. He spent a decade there, mid-90s to early 2000s, studying at the center of Tablighi Jamaat in Pakistan. And under his leadership, you can also say that there has been some initiatives by the Muftiate it has created a special department, for instance, to support Tablighi Jamaat preachers, despite the fact that it's not a registered religious organization. So this is a movement that has developed very quickly, and it's particularly found traction among the younger population. But it's also worth pointing out that in the 1990s, Kyrgyzstan also became kind of a virgin ground almost for various Christian churches and missionaries who could really work in Kyrgyzstan because of their liberal religious policies. But then since the 2000s, you can say that their activities have gradually but steadily been much more curtailed. But then when it comes to the model of secularism in Kyrgyzstan, the separation of religion from the state is even also here, like in Turkmenistan, then enshrined in the constitution here of the Kyrgyz Republic. But at the same time, Kyrgyz laws and policies separate between what is referred to as traditional faith on the one hand and non-traditional faith on the other. And the former then is Hanafi Islam and the Russian Orthodox Church. So they are prioritized and also given preferential treatment due to what they say is its impact on the establishment and development of Kyrgyz statehood. And of course, the role of the Russian Orthodox Church has decreased because of out-migration and things like that. So today, the main traditional religion is Hanafi Islam. So the government's role here, and especially the Muftiate, which has a particular role to promote traditional Islam, so it's responsible for promoting and safeguarding the traditions and principles of traditional Islam. And then another institution here who plays a role, of course, is the State Commission for Religious Affairs, which, just like the Muftiate, its origins date back to the Soviet Union, and its primary task is to reject registration, you can say, of religious groups if they are considered a threat to national security or social stability, ethnic and religious harmony, and other things. In the legal sphere, you can also say, when it comes to legislation, a first law on freedom of religion and religious organizations was adopted already in 1991, which was rather liberal, and quite soon discussions became that evolved around needing the need to replace this law with a stricter one, but this did not happen until 2009. So the reason behind the stricter control was that the government increasingly became worried about what would happen in the religious sphere if it was left unattended. But apart from the law here, there's also been a few concepts on state policy in the sphere of religion. But the main problem with these have been that they have been rather poorly implemented, but one specific thing that they look rather closely at these state concepts is the relationship between the state and Islamic educational institutions. And this is a rather unorganized field in Kyrgyzstan. especially with a big question mark around the quality of all these educational establishments. They are well over 100, so they are significantly more than in the neighboring states that are officially at least registered. But you can say overall that three main aspects eventually have come to dominate state policy towards religion. First is the official support of traditional Islam, Hanafi. The second one is the increasing state intervention to control or keep order in this field. And the third one, of course, which I haven't talked about, but maybe can discuss later, is the motivation here to prevent extremism. But you can also say maybe that in comparison with its neighbors, the weaker administrative and capacity in Kyrgyzstan has made it more difficult to implement and control these more policing measures here in the religious field. Therefore, you can say maybe that to some extent this more pluralistic religious context that continues in Kyrgyzstan compared to the neighbors in a way lingers on by default here because of weaker administrative capacity. Finally, I could also mention just quickly here that Islam in Kyrgyzstan also has become an increasingly important factor also in politics, and that's particularly the case during election campaigns. And because the society has become much more religious, then Islam has also become a more important source of legitimization for politicians and also a resource for the mobilization of voters. So this tends to lead political candidates to openly display their religiosity during election campaigns. For instance, the current president, Jeenbekov, for instance, in the 2017 presidential election, he tried to cultivate this image of himself as a reliable Muslim, you can say. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. Now, listening to both of you, and obviously I encourage everybody listening into this event to read the papers, or at least if you are short on time, the executive summaries to these papers. I think you see bright contrast, and I think, well, one of the reasons of looking at Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan in parallel is also to see how divergent the state practices can be in Central Asian countries. It seems to me that there are several questions that arise out of this. The first one I would like to start with is the one about which I think Johan mentioned and is definitely mentioned in Victoria's paper, which is the contrast between traditional and non-traditional. So in Kyrgyzstan, for example, we see a pattern which is in most other states of Central Asia, as well as in Azerbaijan, that there is government support for traditional religions, that is, religious traditions that have been indigenous, if you will, to the region for a long time, in contrast to religious traditions that are considered to be alien, that is, those that are, recent imports, whether that be, for example, Salafi Islamic movements, or for that matter, whether European, American, or South Korean inspired Baptist churches, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so forth. But there seems to me that while this could be, broadly spoken, said for both countries, there may be a situation in which Turkmenistan differs. As in Uzbekistan, as in Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz state has adopted almost, actually, overtly a support for Hanafi Sunni Islam. But Victoria, it seems to me that you are saying, and from whatever I can read, that in Turkmenistan, the term or the support is for what is called a Turkmen Islam, a national Islam, not specifically if you will, a version of Orthodox Islam that's based on the Hanafi tradition. Could you elaborate perhaps on this? Perhaps first Victoria and then Johan?
Yes, I'd be happy to. First of all, this is you won't find this written down anywhere, right? This is not there's not a doctrine or a paper that we could go to. We have to sort of parse the speeches of the presidents, first Niyazov, then Berdimuhamedov. We have to watch their actions and how they are promoting themselves as leaders and how they are using Islamic practices to legitimize themselves. So that includes making the Hajj, making the Umrah to Mecca, holding iftar dinners, sponsoring sadaqah meals, and especially extolling the virtues of the Sufi heritage. So I think that the way that the greatest manifestation, outward manifestation of worship or an active expression of belief in Turkmenistan is ziyarat, or shrine pilgrimage, which is tied together with Sufi heritage. So there are, especially in the north, especially in Konya-Urgench, but around a couple of other places in the country, and Mari and some other places, there are sites where there is an amalgamation of Sufism, shamanism, animism that come together at, and there are natural sites and there are tombs. So they are burial sites of Sufi sheikhs or peers that people visit, or they are caves, trees that people find spiritual energy in. So this ziyarat, people make these pilgrimages in part to fulfill a personal desire to kind of ask for help, ask for a gift, express their desire for something. It often has to do with fertility. It has to do with hoping to get married. And so there's the going to the saints, the tomb of the saint, for example, like in Konya-Urgench. And the idea is that the power, the holiness of the saint is, he maintains that even in death. And so his burial site still emanates that energy, and he can help a person in their quest for something like getting married, having a baby, even something as simple as getting a new home. So ziyarat is a very important way that we see this expression in Turkmenistan, in the everyday and among the people. But you see the leadership promoting it as well. And it's something that the leadership has deemed as okay, safe, as I said, benign, even conducive to their rule. So this is one of the ways that we see traditional Islam as it's being couched in the terms it's being couched in by the Turkmen leadership. Traditional Islam or Turkmen Islam is being expressed in these ways.
Would it be accurate to say that the Turkmen state has an ambition to either keep Islam the way it has been, or, if you will, return to a pre-Soviet way of Islam while shutting out alien influences?
I don't know how easy it is to talk about an actual going back, but certainly the leadership is promoting its efforts as a return to a pre-Soviet era. So whether that's the historians, we can argue about that, but the leadership is promoting it in that vein. Absolutely.
And Johan, if I can bring you in on this, it seems that in Kyrgyzstan, we have much more of a, or let me actually step back for a moment and note for readers or for viewers who are not entirely familiar with the religiosity in this region, that the Kyrgyz and the Turkmen, both, while very different societies, all have nomadic roots. Which means that traditionally Islam was very different among the nomads than it was among the settled oases of present-day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and parts of southern Kazakhstan, where you've, of course, in the settled oases, cultures of Central Asia, you had much more of the traditional scriptural Islam that is associated with mosques, madrasas, and rather hierarchical institutions. And that makes the contrast of modern Turkmenistan with modern Kyrgyzstan, I think, so interesting, because here it seems to me from what Johan said that there is, and to some extent, a departure from what may have been the traditional Kyrgyz form of folk Islam. You said it's still there, but when you talk about the growth of Tabligh Jamaat, we also know in the south, in the rather heavily Uzbek populated south of Kyrgyzstan, we earlier had a rise of influence from both South Asia and from the Arab Middle East. Would you say that there is much more of a shift in terms of alien influences on religion in Kyrgyzstan, and that?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what you said. I mean, in Kyrgyzstan, I mean, developed a much historically, as you said, with in southern Kyrgyzstan, for instance, if you compare to the Uzbeks that had long developed a strong religious identity, the Kyrgyz nomads had this much lighter attachment to Islam in this sense, and they also for quite some time also retained many of these pre-Islamic beliefs. That especially was the case with Tengrism, the traditional belief of the Kyrgyz here, which had this strong focus on rituals, and which especially focused on the cult of the sky. And but gradually, of course, also then in the process of Islamization, you can say that many of the customs and ancient beliefs took Islamized forms. But then, of course, then when you came to this Soviet transformation of Central Asia and this militantly secular state, which banned all the religious activities and outside of the strictly controlled official channels. So then, of course, 7 decades of Soviet socialist rule, which was, of course, indoctrinated in schools and workplaces, which further left Kyrgyzstan isolated from the Muslim community, world community, and from religious training and all that. So in a way, maybe you can say that this combination here of the lighter attachment originally, but also then, of course, this Soviet period, to some extent maybe made Kyrgyzstan kind of a clean sheet here that could be, which might explain some of this diversity and the versatility here in the religious sphere in the country. But it's, as you mentioned, it's interesting to see, for instance, Tabligh Jamaat, which has become so popular in the 90s. Of course, that was mainly by missionaries who came and preached, tried to this call to join the movement. But then nowadays it's mainly almost exclusively Kyrgyz who continue this tradition. And you can also see that, for instance, it seems to be almost exclusively dominated by Kyrgyz, ethnic Kyrgyz, while it has found much less appeal among, for instance, Uzbeks. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to move to another question right now, which is change and evolution over time. I think particularly in Johan's paper, there is a lot more political change in Kyrgyzstan, obviously, than has been the case in Turkmenistan. But we can watch over the 4 or 5 presidents Kyrgyzstan has had a significant shift. I'll let you speak about that in a minute. But Victoria, do you see any shift over time? I think it was quite recently in Turkmenistan that there were new laws on religion that were introduced, if I'm not mistaken. Do you see any change in the state attitude in the past decade or so? Because for background, I think in many Central Asian countries and in Azerbaijan, especially places like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, that had a relatively more liberal approach than Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan did, we see a sharpening and an increasingly restrictive approach emerging by, let's say, 2009, 2010. By contrast, in Uzbekistan, nothing much changed until President Mirziyoyev came in a few years ago and started releasing some of these restrictions, which obviously, being the biggest country in Central Asia, may or may not have impact on the other countries. But is there any change? Has there been any change in your analysis of how Turkmenistan has approached religion?
Yes, and this will echo a little bit of what Johan was just saying. Certainly in the 1990s, there was a great interest expressed in various aspects of religion, and especially Islam, because I keep talking about Islam because Turkmenistan is not as diverse as some of the other countries in Central Asia or as Azerbaijan. It is somewhere between 89 and 93% Muslim. So I do keep saying Islam. There are representations of Christian and some Jewish practitioners in the country, but it's mostly Muslim. So there was mosques were being built by the state and by individuals. So even in 2003, I visited the Caspian Sea region. I visited a village in the desert, and the people there were coming together as a village to build a mosque. They were taxing themselves, they were giving the materials, they were each contributing something, and they were coming together to financially support a young man who wanted to study to be a mullah, and they sent him to Iran. So there are a variety of expressions that we see that has that changed the level of expression, and the level of interest, I think, has been dampened in more recent years. And there's a less of a, you don't see as many mosques being built, you don't see as much mosque going. However, there are some, it's contradictory again, because the law that you mentioned was initially issued under President Niyazov, who died in 2006. So he issued a law on religion that required every religious group to be, in order to exist legally in the country, to be registered with the government. And that each group had to have a minimum of 500 signatories. They had to give their names, addresses, etc. Okay, so that law was reissued under Berdimuhamedov, the second president, and the number was reduced to 50. So you only need to have 50 signatures or 50 participants to have a registered religious group, which makes it easier. So there's a little bit of a contradiction, because we have less opportunity to go to mosques, fewer mosques being built, and yet it's a little bit easier to become a registered group. Now, is the government actually registering more groups? No. But the laws make it seem as if it's easier to do so. The other thing I'll say that relates to what Johan was saying is that there's very limited, very little outside influence on the way religion is practiced in Turkmenistan. So in the 90s, you had the Turkish groups coming with the Fethullah Gulen movement. You had some mosques and a cultural center being built by the Turkish embassy, and one mosque by the United Arab Emirates. But we just don't see that today. The Turkish schools have been closed down. The Turkish mosque is no longer okay to attend. The Arab Emirates mosque is no longer popular. So there's very little external influence on the way things are practiced. And I have to go back to ziyarat, because that is the way you see people practicing. They're not going to the mosque as much. There's even a question about to what degree they're doing things like fasting, the various expressions of the faith. And ziyarat is one that is still, I think is the strongest and most commonly seen outward expression of faith.
Thank you. Building on what we spoke earlier, Johan, there's a question from Dushon Shamatov online, who asked how widely the word Hanafi is used as part of the discourse in Kyrgyzstan and in which circles. Perhaps you could address this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course, if you look at the official documents and also the the concepts or the state concepts on religious policy, then when you refer to the traditional faith, Islamic faith, then it's clearly stipulated that it's the Hanafi school of Islam that is in Kyrgyzstan. Then, of course, so the question often becomes then that these other alien forms of Islam, that how to prevent them from like undermining the traditional Islam that is really part then of like the Kyrgyz identity and things like that. But then, of course, you also have in the scholarly debate or the reporting on this, of course, also concerns this issue of for instance, Tablighi Jamaat, how that shall relate to is that really Hanafi Islam, or is this to be interpreted as something different? But then the position, for instance, of the Muftiate now is that with this current Mufti is that this preacher or call that is very much in line with how actually an effective way of promoting Hanafi Islam in Kyrgyzstan.
Let me just, as a follow-up to that, note that as in many religious traditions, there is a lot of controversy over what exactly a tradition is. Obviously, Hanafi Islam spread in South Asia, and as we know from the early 20th century, the Deobandi school of Islam, which is nominally Hanafi, grew very strong in South Asia and present-day India and Pakistan, as well as in areas in Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban were Deobandi. Now, if you take the Taliban's understanding of religious tradition, I would submit that even though you can technically trace it to the Hanafi tradition, it's very, very hard to compare that with the core Hanafi areas of traditional, Central Asian Hanafi jurisprudence hundreds of years ago, or for that matter, the Ottoman empires and the Turkish Hanafi tradition. So I think in Kyrgyzstan, we see a mufti who is using that connection with something nominally Hanafi, but as Johan said, the question to what extent these traditions that are being introduced by Tabligh Jamaat really are in conformity with Central Asian Hanafism is probably a more complicated question. I would like to ask a question of both of you that perhaps may be difficult, as always, probably more difficult in the Turkmen case, and that is about the views of the population at large. Now, obviously, in Turkmenistan, we don't have a lot of opinion surveys, but is it possible to say something about how the Turkmen population perceives the government policy on religion? Are they generally happy with the restrictions that allow folk Islam to predominate, but that are very restrictive towards alien tradition? Or is there, in your experience and from whatever sources you have, an appetite in Turkmen society for a broader religious debate or religious freedom for other religious traditions to be present in the country?
I would say, in my experience, there is a desire for more dialogue, more experimentation, more opportunity to explore. For example, in 2001, when I was living there, there were books that were circulating among the people discreetly and against the guidance of the authorities, and people did it because they were afraid they would get in trouble if it was learned that they were reading these. Some of these were just like Fethullah Gülen's book Risale-i Nur, his teacher's book. Those books were circulating, but it was being passed hand to hand. I think there's probably more interest in going to mosques than the government allows for. I think that people hold back because they're afraid to go, and it's not that people don't go to mosques, they do, but there's a perception, as I understand it, in society, that it's possible to be perceived as too Muslim. And this is why I mentioned before, we're not even sure. When I was there in the late 90s, people were so happy to talk about things like fasting. They were so happy to mark holidays, and they were boastful that they were fasting. Whereas now there's a question about whether or not that is even, to what degree that's okay, and certainly people are not boasting about it. So while the Mufti in, was it 2019, I think it was, published that book on how to fast, and yet in the same year there were reports coming out of the country saying that the government is not talking about fasting during the holidays, and so people are not sure about whether or not it's okay, because we have a situation where the society takes its cues from the government as to what is permissible and not permissible.
Thank you very much. Johan, if I may ask you, we have seen over the past several years in some countries of Central Asia surveys about religious observance, about also viewpoints related to religion. And one of them that caught relatively strong attention were, I think, the Pew poll a few years ago that asked questions such as support for Sharia law. And we found that most of the regional countries, by the way, I should mention that Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan were not allowed to ask this question, so we don't have an answer. But that in places like Kazakhstan and in Azerbaijan, it was under 10% of people who supported it. But the Kyrgyz figure was relatively high. It was close to 30%. And Tajikistan was slightly under that. I think that surprised a lot of people. And I wonder if you could talk about this, because I think the question is, does this really reflect a conviction that Sharia law and the people really know what Sharia law is and what it means? Or does it reflect a general answer to or unhappiness with corruption in the country? And the idea would be that Islamic law would get rid of much of the mismanagement, corruption, and criminality?
I think rather the second aspect, I would suspect, rather that there's some of course of social frustration and these type of aspects that really I think is driving this, rather than some strict ideological understandings or beliefs in this. But I would say that maybe very simplified, you can maybe see three main attitudes here in Kyrgyz society today. First, you have this predominantly secular political, economic, and intellectual elite mainly in Bishkek, but also some other cities. And of course, this group used to be completely dominant, but you can see that it's gradually losing its position now in a less secular society. And the second group you can call is, I would say, it's been, of course, past decade at least, a stronger focus on among the nationalist-minded Kyrgyz citizens, which increasingly also embrace more traditional Islam than as part of that identity. And this is a very broad group, but that's one main group. And then the third one maybe is this more Islamic currents that with representatives who try to really convert existing Muslims to more conservative versions of Islam. And maybe you can assume that the strong support that exists for Sharia, if you believe some of these polls, then that it's found among this category of citizens. I would say like that. But then maybe you had a question earlier also about the developments there and the political dimension in Kyrgyzstan, which is interesting in Kyrgyzstan because you have had 4 or even 5 presidents, so you can really see also this, that personalities, I would say, also matters, has mattered in Kyrgyzstan in this sphere, even if of course there are some other factors that have, you know, maybe irrespective of which president, they would have reacted to some extent, but you can see differences here between them. If you look at Akayev in the beginning, he was you know, took a very big interest in many of these aspects, you know, remember the transition to market economy and the thinking about the history of Kyrgyz statehood and things like that. All these things he wrote big books about, but when it came to religion or Islam, it was not very much interest at all from his side. Yeah, so apparently quite it had disinterest here in the religious aspect. So on one hand, that allowed it to be much more open and free, but on the other hand, it became rather religion wasn't politicized in that sense, but it still became difficult to control in. And then if you compare to with Akayev, even if he also introduced some stricter measures, you can say that Bakiyev, he was this also typical product of the Soviet system. So he mainly focused on Islam as a way to control, or the securitized against Islam. Yeah, worried about the threats there that the extremism could pose and things like that. But he did not really. So in that sense, he introduced a few the first law and then also a state concept and things like that. But he didn't really have any ideological narratives on how to develop Islam or how to integrate it into the nation building process. But then Atambayev, he was probably more the one who started more emphasizing Islam, especially his he was also highly suspicious of foreign traditions and foreign influences, but he made frequent references to Islam in his speeches and things like that. But often it was very much his private also beliefs and feelings that dominated. But then of course nowadays Jeenbekov, he's much more focusing on constructing a kind of partnership between political and religious leaders. If you compare to Bakiyev or Atambayev, it was more like what they said and religious leaders should implement, but this is you can see some changes here depending on the person in power.
Thank you. We are slowly running out of time. I would like to take up a question asked by Ogul Jamal Yazlieva, which is as follows. What can be said about the relationship of religion and local media? How is Turkmenistan Islam promoted in the media? And is it possible to say that it is restricted to discuss religious traditions in Turkmenistan? I think this is for you, Victoria.
Okay, well, I should say hello to Ogul Jamal, and thank you for the question. Yes and no. Yes, there's a restriction. There's no free media in Turkmenistan, but at the same time, it's not only okay. It's the state needs a discussion, references to Islam. So we see, you even see pieces of the Hadith or the Quran published in the early 90s in the press. We see today in travel magazines a promotion and illustrations about ziyarat. So there's been a shift over time as to what gets emphasized. In the early 90s, it was the formal texts, the Orthodox text, the Hadith, the Quran. And today it's more about popular expression and that traditional Islam, traditional Turkmen Islam, the folk Islam, or the ziyarat and the Sufi inspired Islam.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have now been going for close to an hour, which is our allotted time for today. I would like to start by thanking you both for your papers and for your presentations and comments. I think what your two papers suggest is that it's a very dynamic field that we are talking about in terms of how the state and religion in Central Asia are interacting with each other. There are very different conditions in different countries of Central Asia. We also see certain similarities, at least in terms of the formal structure and the formal framework, if you will, through which state institutions deal with religion. I think we can see how elites, and that's another topic we haven't gotten into so much today, maybe we'll say that for another time. We may not know so much about it, but we know that elites themselves are composed of human beings, and human beings are to various degrees interested in spiritual affairs. And obviously the leadership we have in Central Asia today is not the same as we had in the early 1990s, when obviously we had a fully Soviet generation that was in charge of these countries. I think overall, the big question for the entire region is whether Central Asia is going to maintain into the more distant future a very distinct approach to religion, both on the part of societies and on the part of states. I referenced Pew polls earlier, and if I urge anybody interested in this issue to consult the Pew polls on religion across the Muslim world, because what you find is that on many questions that include and that focus on issues of religious tolerance, you find that Central Asia really stands out, that there is a much more tolerant approach, for example, on questions, what you should do with people who leave Islam, or that type of questions. You find a much higher degree of religious tolerance towards non-religious people, towards people of different religious traditions in Central Asia, while you also have the secular state traditions, which, as we have seen, are interpreted in Central Asia not to mean the American sense of secularism, as in fully promoting the freedom of religion, but a much more French-inspired or even Turkish-inspired model of state intervention into making sure that the state and society are not impacted by a dominant religious tradition. Now, the question going forward is whether 30 years from now, when we have a fully non-Soviet generation that is probably going to be in power, whether Central Asia will be more like the rest of the Muslim world, or whether it will continue to be distinguished by its own way of handling this issue. And only then will we really know to what extent Central Asian states' approach to religion is really Soviet, or if you will, a continuation or a Soviet legacy, if you will, and to what extent it really goes back to pre-Soviet traditions, where also Central Asia was very different from the Arab world. It was very different from South Asia, for example. From what I've heard today, it would seem to me that Kyrgyzstan, if anything, shows certain indications of being much more affected and taking up influences from elsewhere in the Muslim world. Both of you mentioned Turkish influences, which are, of course, culturally much more closer to the Central Asian traditions. But we see in a lot of places South Asian traditions, especially as Johan mentioned in Kyrgyzstan, that probably a lot of people would not have been aware of. I would urge everybody who is interested in the topic to keep looking at the production from the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute. Hopefully, in the not too distant future, we will be able to complete our series of case studies with a case study of Tajikistan. And then we will also work to produce more comparative material on whether there is a Central Asian model for religion-state interaction, and if so, what that model is. With that, I would like to conclude by urging everybody to keep in mind that we have CAMCA Week, the CAMCA Forum, which was supposed to be held in Almaty. This week is not being held, and instead we have eCAMCA, Everybody should go to camcaforum.org if you want analysis on what the Central Asian region, Mongolia, and the Caucasus, how they are doing through the pandemic, what the economic impact is. You have a lot of very prominent speakers. Tomorrow, there is a keynote address and a question and answer session featuring Robert Zoellick, who is the former president of the World Bank. On Wednesday, we have a panel session on the post-coronavirus pandemic challenges and opportunities for the region. On Thursday, there's a panel session on Afghanistan with the subtitle, What Comes First? Peace, Trade, or Both Together. And finally, on Friday, we have a panel session that is a CAMCA network report on intra-regional trade and the growth potential in the region. There are detailed instructions for how to access this content and how to take part in these discussions. I urge you all to do so. But for now, I would like to thank particularly our two authors and speakers, Victoria Clement and Johan Engvall. And I would also like to thank everybody who was part of this discussion. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.